Hi everyone, welcome to our second talk in English today. I welcome Ophi that will talk about actually useful measurement and reporting for appsec and vulnerability management programs. So I'll let you go on this.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And if not, then this is going to be really boring. Just wanted to start off with this. Intelligent metrics can help you. And if you think of metrics and do them poorly, then it can be a source of really, really, really bad behavior, confusion, unhappiness, and systematic dissent. And I often see it done really, really poorly, which is the crux of why I built this talk in the first place. Okay, this is me. I am a director at Security Compass, and I'm one of the co-leads of the OWASP Toronto chapter. The key takeaway is that I've been in a couple of different appsec and also infrastructure roles and focus majority on appsec. So a lot of the stuff you'll see here today is really focused around that. But you can find me at owasp.org. Feel free to reach out. Okay, so just going to give you my standard disclaimers. My opinions are my opinions. None of what I say represents the view of my employers. I have to say that because I don't want them to get into any trouble. They're nice enough to let me speak without a gag order, so that's really nice of them, and I want them to continue. And then I built a few images for this presentation, and they're all fairly terrible because I'm not a very good visual person. So any of the nice images that you see probably belong to someone else. I will try to credit them. And then I show some products in this presentation, but I'm not advocating for them. They just happen to be things that I know. Okay. We can't really talk about measurement and reporting unless we talk first about scope and objectives, and because they're pointless without that, right? These are the questions I usually think hard about before I start down any particular path, and I'll suggest a couple of things shortly to supplement. But the situational awareness portion is important, and then the measurement and reporting portion presupposes that you know what the hell you're doing today in terms of capabilities, personnel, tooling, your process, and some of your drivers, or at least that you're going to go find out. And then these things mostly go towards figuring out or monitoring everything aside from this, what are we trying to solve portion. Okay. You hear people talk about objectives being smart, and that's really just answering the same questions that I put in the previous slide. But what you usually get when somebody talks about this is like somebody saying something like this is their high-level mission, right? You reduce risk by catching vulnerabilities before they make it into production. And I find that kind of statement a little bit useless. We're still left to actively define what we're supposed to be doing along with appropriate measures and behaviors. And so really, these are my guiding principles when I go and build security programs for people or when I look at metrics and reporting. Okay. Carrie Kompakis, I think her name is, gives this very famous parenting advice. You prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. And I believe that this applies to security, but keep in mind, you don't put a toddler who's learning to walk on a mountain path. You probably put them in some kind of cleared, carpeted area and then give them a hand and some encouragement at first and then go from there, right? So the same really applies to a security program. When it's young and you're immature, you prepare some safe paths that the business can walk. And then you teach them the elements that make the path safe. And then eventually the program matures enough that people will want to take areas and change them or need to take areas and change them. And then you can sit there and kind of remind them of the objectives and try to help them reach it, right? But at that point, you're giving them advice and perspective, and then you're letting them do what they need to do. Because it's theirs, like the code, if you're an appsec, the code belongs to the product team. You can't touch it, and it's not, they wouldn't even want you to touch it if you could half the time, right? And then the last part of this guiding principle is like, your colleagues are not the children that you're trying to teach, right? Your colleagues are presumably contributing to their area of expertise to help the business either make money or reduce risk or do something else. And so don't knock their expertise or contribution. It's the organization that's the child, and security is the journey. I'm not going to go into maturity processes. You can look at OAuth SAM. You can look at this particular one, which is the U.S. Federal Cybersecurity Maturity Model, CMMC. I'll probably refer back to this a little bit, but you're trying to get through this maturing process, right? And how do you move people through the maturity process? Well, you kind of do it like this. So a lot of the industry is stuck on this scan and fix and fighting fires. And fundamentally, I think it's because we only do stages 3 and 4 of this cycle. Like we test and then we nag people to fix things. Then we test again and then we nag them and then they kind of ignore us and get angry about it, which I totally understand, right? So imagine you're building a school system that's like this. The first day of school, your kids show up or a kid shows up and you get a test and then the teacher tells them, like, here's all the things that you did wrong, now go fix it, and then next week we'll test you again. You're going to get a lot of dropouts from school that way. And you're going to get a lot of very disgruntled people, and justifiably so, right? So what we're actually trying to do is figure out with our entire program is figure out some reasonable curriculum and then set expectations. Like this term, we'll be learning these things, and here are the learning objectives. You'll have some midterm tests, some final exams, and then we'll go back and look at report cards and look at how we did and look at all these other things that we were measuring and see what we missed, see what we did poorly on, what we need to revise on, and go forward from there, right? Having said that, there is 2 realities that you have to deal with when it comes to reporting and measurement. So if you're in a situation where the business line owns the risk and they know it and they're acting on it and all the rest of that stuff, like you're in a small organization and they get that security is theirs, you're in really good shape. And if you're like a lot of us in larger organizations, then InfoSec is really accountable for risk, even though the business nods and says like, yeah, I own risk, and like they don't behave like it. So they're not closing vulnerabilities. They don't give they don't care, right? Keep that in mind. You're dealing with these things, then one of the things that you should keep in mind about your metrics and reporting is that a lot of it is there for you to build a communication channel with people, to have something to talk about, to give you the information that you need to propose business cases or action plans and negotiate the details on what it is that they're going to do for security and by when, right? And then after that, once you guys have the agreement on what you're going to do, then you use the reporting for visibility and improvement. Okay. If you're in a place where the business already cares, then you can skip right to it, and that's amazing. This is just another view of the purpose of measuring, reporting, and lifecycle. As you operate and you measure the program that you're in and you spend time on different pieces of measurement, you can then analyze it and figure out what you're going to do later. It's kind of obvious, but people don't see it as part of a larger framework. So this is why I put these types of diagrams together so that they can look at things and kind of look at the big picture a little bit more. We talked a little bit about objectives. We talked a little bit about what is the purpose of measurement and reporting in the larger framework. Now, when you get to actual measurement, these are heavily, again, related to your goals to find out how you're supposed to be meeting your objectives. And I also want to just point out here that don't mix measurement with metrics, right? You have targets, you have metrics, you have other things that you're reporting to specific people in some areas, right? And that goes into your reports, right? But measurement, especially on its own, is just figuring stuff out, right? Looking at the variables, figuring out what looks funny, right? Targets are for hitting. Measurements are just for figuring out what you're doing. And so don't confuse them. Okay. This stuff goes back to watching and asking yourself the question, how do we know we're solving the problem that we've set out to solve? And how do we know if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing? If you talk to change management people, they're always talking about, getting people to do the thing by building a burning platform and collecting overwhelming data. That all starts with this measurement aspect. So we'll get into some of these things as part of the next bit, but let's first talk about reporting and what the objectives are there. Okay. reporting isn't the same thing exactly. It's kind of two sides of the same coin. You use the reporting to get other people to do things. You use the reporting to show progress towards your objectives. And you use the reporting to show what course of action you would recommend to people and what the consequence would be to not do that thing. Okay, so you really want to target these things at the people that you're reporting to and what they care about, and give them some kind of takeaway. Either it should be information based so that you're tracking trends, or it should be like, because of this, you should do this other thing. Any questions so far? Okay, I don't see any in the chat channel.
Yeah, you're good.
Mm-hmm. For reporting, I have a couple of guiding principles here too. The main thing is to show your work, okay? And the more ornery the people are on the other side of the table, the more you have to overcome a like cultural barrier or like verticals and like other roadblocks that you have, already bad blood between you and other teams and whatnot, the more important it is to show your work. If you take a test and you don't show your work, like in school, right? You either get 0 marks or you get full marks, but you don't get anywhere in between. And it's the same to a large degree with your security program. If you show your work, the other people that you're talking to, hopefully you have the opportunity to talk to them and say, hey, does this make sense to you? Are these variables that I've captured the real ones? Should I consider anything else? Am I going down a ditch? Right? Is it doable? All those questions you can ask once you show your work, right? And they can then help you correct. They can also help participate in this, in the discussion and in the process, right? And you have a basis for negotiation on what it is that you're going to do and how long you're going to take to do that, right? And then that means also that your security program or the objective or the particular actions that you're taking, like this campaign that you're going on, might get full marks or partial marks, but very, very rarely do you end up outright failing with no notice. And I find that lots of the people that I work with end up, embarking on this 2-year program to do something, and then they fail at the end, and they're like, why did that happen? And we're like, well, okay, because you didn't show your work and nobody could sanity check it. The other part is you shouldn't have any unexplained numbers. Everything should come with a story, right? If you're just saying like, I have 3 high vulnerabilities and 4 medium vulnerabilities, like, I don't care. The next time a CVE comes out, you're going to have tons more. That's not the point, okay? And it should never be the point, because you're trying to build a program. You're not trying to give them necessarily, like, I'm not saying that situational awareness for right now isn't needed, but it's not everything. And you also want to have a story behind that too, so people don't freak out, right? The other part about reporting is that you actually need to allocate consistent time and resources and effort to measure and report it consistently, or it's just going to flop. That consistency is something that lots of people miss. And they don't understand that, like, part of their everyday activities for their team will be measuring different aspects of the program all the time. If you're not measuring something at some point, like trying to collect data points on things that you are interested in, you're gonna go nowhere really, really fast. You're gonna be stuck in this like, shoot the latest vuln, shoot it now. That cycle, lots of people are stuck there because they don't allocate the resources. They're thinking like, oh, I'll do this at the end of the year. Well, if you wanted to collect 3 months worth of data, that's not going to help for you. That's not going to help you. And sometimes you need the 3 months to show that something is a trend and not a one-off. Okay. And then the last thing is focus on making progress. So again, the more ornery the audience you're dealing with, the more you can ask them like, okay, what do you think is reasonable, and go from there, right? As long as you're showing, as long as they make the commitment and then they have to own it to some degree. You can use the reporting to make it clear what you guys agreed on and whether or not they're getting towards it. But without their agreement, you're nagging them. So it's fine, but you probably want to try to rearrange the conversation a little bit so that you're doing something more proactive, and also so that you get farther faster. So that's reporting. I see Luke is asking, are you using the term measuring for monitoring? And to a degree, yes, but measuring is just like getting data points to some degree. The monitoring comes afterwards. The monitoring, you probably want to monitor through the reporting that you're doing, right? So the monitoring is about stories, about trending, about all the other bits. The measuring part is just like, I need to know this piece of data. I need to know that piece of data. I kind of want to get some idea of how long this takes, that kind of stuff. You can analyze the measures that you have, the data points that you have afterwards. You probably want to have obviously you want to have a hypothesis first. So we'll go through some of that too. Okay, so let's talk details. Situational awareness. What are we doing today? Okay, what are some of the things that I would suggest that you get as part of your program right off the bat? This one's difficult. Work cadence is actually one of those ones where I suggest to people and they have no idea how to do this one, but it's super common for consulting companies to do this kind of work, to track where their work cadence is, how much time is spent, how much overhead they have, and they use that to forecast what their team can actually get done, their busy periods, plan their work, and all the rest of these things. You'll notice that like the very efficient people who are billing by the hour, like lawyers, will also do this, right? If you want to have some idea of where you're going with different things, there are some rules of thumb that you can probably go with to inform these decisions. But this is you building out the, how shall I say, the budget for your group, not in terms of money, like when you build your home budget, in terms of money, like where your groceries are, like how much your groceries cost and how much your rent costs and those types of things. You're doing the same thing. You're building out a budget. Here, it's just the budget is for the work time and the effort for your team, so you know where all the time and materials is going, and also how much of your time is spent on each of the individual pieces of your program. So usually we try to apply something like the 80-20 rule, which is like 80% operational things that are fixing today, and then 20% that's going towards the future. Keeping in mind that you probably have about 20% of overhead and administration in any kind of organization. So those types of things will let you keep track of whether or not you're meeting that objective over time, or if you're just spinning your wheels, right? And the other part, you can do it based on this sort of thing, which is keeping track of where you're doing things today by building out kind of like your time budget. But you can also do time and effort estimation, which is how a lot of consulting companies scope out work. So you start from something like figuring out your available FTE days. So you have 52 weeks in a year, you have about 5 work days, and you have about 7.5 hours of work. You have vacation allotments, floating holidays, LNG allowance, sick allowance, stat holidays, other allowance, and then you have maybe 20% daily admin overhead if you add up all the meetings that you go to and the time you spend going to the bathroom, reading your emails, responding to different things, that kind of stuff. And then you can calculate total FTE time available for a year. And this is a ballpark. This is not like, don't use these things as your absolute guidance for what people should be spending on their work hours, because it's not going to happen. But you're closer to understanding where your availability is than you were when you kind of stuck your finger in the air and go, well, I think it's 3 people, right? So then after you have that, you can look into fixed cost estimates. So there are some things where you know that there's a sequence of things that are going to happen, and or you're going to contract something out to people and you know kind of what the effort time is, you can make a rough estimate, right? You can make a rough estimate of like the elapsed time that it takes, and then the required like resources and so on. And you can just put that out in a sheet and figure out, okay, that's so many FTEs worth of available days if everything goes smoothly. And then you have some gut feeling for like how smoothly or not smoothly it goes. And if you don't, then your PMO probably does. So get them to tell you what the estimated time is. Some people it's up to 30% wasted. So you can put those numbers in to model the system that you're working with, and then adjust as you go along, as you feel like you're hitting targets or not hitting targets. Okay. Once you get there, you can work into time and material estimates. So let's say you have a target of like, I need to do a scan on so many applications. I need to reach a total of 15 or 20 teams. I need to do X number of reviews per year. I need to do a certain number of that translates into a certain number of reviews per portfolio. What's my SLA? What's the elapsed time? What's the actual handover period? Like all these things, you have a rough estimate of those things that you're doing. And now you can sort of run your numbers. Like if I am doing an architecture review and it takes, about 28 days to do it, actual effort on the high end, and then about 20 days on a low end, right? Then that'll give me about 8,400 days or hours per year that I need to actually use to do this work as it's defined today, right? And that means I need about 61 FTEs. Okay, well, that's a lot of FTEs, and probably nobody's going to actually agree to do that, which means, okay, you have something that you need to do. You need to look at the process that you're doing, and you need to make a lot of these very short. And you can talk to people about like, what is a reasonable assessment time period? Like at what point does it become pointless to do anything, right? Is there something that we can do to make it so that we don't have to do follow-up meetings? Is there something that we can do to make it so that we can do kickoffs more effectively? Is there something that we can do to reduce the amount of time that an SME needs to spend on this particular thing, to reduce this to like a reasonable-ish number? And then you can run numbers and you can say like, okay, well, I have 4 FTEs available. So you can do some sanity checking in this as well. If I have 4 FTEs available to do this work at a ballpark level, they should be completing about 82 assessments in a week, which is probably really, really, really you can look at that and think like, okay, that is not even remotely something that could be done. And then you can also look at like how many concurrent activities should they be working on roughly in a week, given the elapsed time that is required, and given that the actual time effort that is required. Right? So all these are really ballpark things, but you can look at these numbers and think, okay, that's really unreasonable. What are our strategies to make this reasonable, and start there as your method of conversation around what are we going to do about this problem, right? If you look at metrics and you look at tracking and you don't have excuse me, information about what's reasonable and how your week-to-week cadence is supposed to work, then you start getting into some really strange things where like your project is delayed and you don't know it. And you eventually end up, 3 to 4 months delayed on the entire project, or like a significant amount delayed because you didn't really understand what your workflow and cadence should be. So these things will help you have a rough estimate for it, have a rough like model in your mind that you can at least work toward and then correct as you go along. Okay, so going back now to the work cadence, once you get some interesting information here. You can look at like how much time you're using to fight fires and when. You can look at like how much you're doing in terms of strategic work. You can look at like, oh, you're taking all your vacation in this time period, so maybe you can plan for it better next time. There's lots of organizations where like the work cadence is super bursty. So at the beginning of the year, they do a lot of work. At like September, October timeframe, they do a lot of work. In the March, April timeframe, they do a moderate amount of work, and then it's dead during Christmas time, and it's dead during the summer holidays. And that means that they really should know that, hey, one, they can use that time to plan for different things or breathe, right? And maybe they should have different focus during that time. When they're really super operationally busy, they shouldn't try to do anything else, right? And when they are super, super slow and they still have the availability for people, then they can do things like plan their next campaigns, their next education. They can do all the analysis during that time when they have sort of data and some time to sit there and think about things. And then also like being able to quantify how much unplanned time, like how much your boss comes to you and goes like, I need you to put this fire out, sometimes helps them to back off if they want you to be doing other things. Okay. And then other things that you might want to do just to basically get the lay of land is to figure out out of super, low tech level, give people a spreadsheet. Like these are the kinds of things that I think my team is going to be doing and the kinds of skills that I think they're going to need and the kinds of work that we do. Are they interested in it? Do they have experience? Like self-rating is still fine. It's still better than not having any data. And then they can self-assess their knowledge. And then you can look at like, oh, okay, career pathing for people. What are they actually wanting to get into? Because people doing things that they're interested in is always going to be better than people doing things that they're not interested in. And then you can look at also across the board, like, oh, we actually offer this service and like one dude knows how to do it. That's probably not good. Right. So things like this are not difficult things to do, but they actually do give you a lot of interesting situational awareness that you might not have really thought about before. And then I talked about the time and effort estimator a little bit. You do need to use, like you can use stuff like that back of a paper napkin to do your effort estimations, figure out kind of how your progress tracking should work, and then do some sanity checking on where you should be on a week-to-week basis. Couple that with your like workflow and the actual budget that you have, and you can look at are you making reasonable progress even without having your PM tell you you're behind. And then I just wanted to put out a warning. So there are a couple of key takeaways from like doing time and effort estimation this particular way. And if you're looking to read more about it, then you should probably just read this book, which is The Mythical Man Month. And it's the only recommendation I will actually make about a specific product. But this guy talks about a couple of key things. Adding manpower to a late software project makes it later, and that's Brooks' Law, because of communication and learning overhead. So as you're doing time and effort estimation for larger and larger groups of people, there is a communication and learning overhead that you're going to need to add more people for to overcome that aspect. And there's a certain point at which adding more people to something just makes it worse, okay, especially in terms of time. So don't be like, I can accomplish this thing by just throwing more people at it. That's not true. And a couple of the key takeaways, if you've never read this book, is that like some jobs take however long they make, and managing by deadlines is really going to either give you no results or give you really undesirable results. And then it matters who you assign to the job. So the classic example here to illustrate this point is if you want to make a baby, you cannot say that you're going to throw 9 women at the problem to get a baby in a month. And also, if you assign 5 physiologically male people to this problem, you may not get the result you're looking for. And so I'll leave it at that. And then the other thing is that complex systems are just going to have some irreducible number of errors because it's complex, because you're constantly searching for them, because you are constantly adding new things. It's okay to know that that's going to happen. The point is to try to get it down to some reasonable amount. Okay. Now, if you're going through and talking about portfolio coverage at the very, very, very basic, you can do something like this. What do I know that I have today? What do I cover for whatever value of cover you can come up with? What is out of scope? What is not yet addressed from the things I know about? And then a total. This is not weirdly easy to put together, but you have to start from somewhere. So this is where you can start, right? Once you get there, you can get into deeper things like what does it mean to cover a infrastructure element, a host, a application, right? What tools are you actually using on this thing to discover what kinds of things in the security pipeline? What controls are you using? And you can pick, you know, your favorite framework and work off of that, because at least it gives you somewhere to start with a gap analysis. It gives you somewhere to think about what your next steps are. Those are the important parts, is to start somewhere, to make progress, to have somewhere that you're looking at, some criteria that you're checking against, that the rest of the team and the rest of the organization can understand that those doesn't need you to be constantly in front of them dancing through this concept, right? Once you get to your manually put together thing about coverage, you could possibly, hopefully, move towards some kind of automation. So this is just Jenkins. And you can look at, the different phases and the different pieces of what coverage means to you. Look at when things were covered last, which is interesting, recurrences, when things are failing, you can get auto notifications, those kinds of things. So the automation portion is interesting. You should totally spend time doing it as you're moving through the maturity chain. But this is sort of where I would go next with it. To just get us, I've seen clients and help them do stuff like just take this information, put their entire pipeline, at least to some degree here, and then push whatever they have in terms of scan statuses to a database or a dashboard or just to a page on Confluence so that they can check in one place. And then you can get into really fun, detailed, what it means to have coverage for my portfolio in things like for application security, you can look at, code coverage or test coverage, right? The key for these particular things also then is to look at your asset management database and then talk about like how do you on one side improve the information you have about the assets that you have in the organization and who owns them, and then the other part is getting deep into the coverage that you actually have and defining what coverage means and what good enough coverage means. Okay, but these things, as you collect the data, you actually have somewhere to start thinking and talking about it. Okay, and then you can decide. A lot of the times people, again, use different measures, like they look at the SANS Top 25 for vulnerability management and infrastructure. They look at like BSIM or MITRE ATT&CK or any of those other frameworks to talk to them, to inform themselves about what other people consider to be coverage, and then measure themselves against it to look at where they should be going and where they are today. If you got questions, please put them and I will answer them. Or comments. I also take heckling. Okay, I'll go into getting other people to do things. This is the other part about reporting. It's one of the major things. You really want to use it to get people to do things, to create actionable plans, to do ROI, that kind of stuff. And really you're asking the question of like who, what, when, where, why, and then presenting it to people, right? Here are some classical tactics that people say that you can use to get other people to do things, hopefully, right? They say you should gamify, your team is doing this, and that team is doing more than you, and you're falling behind your peers, and you should do this more because I'm going to shame you into it, basically, right? And then they talk about rewards and recognition, and they say like, okay, you guys are clearly more secure, so you should get more fun projects, you should get more autonomy, you should get more something else cool, t-shirt, whatever. And that's cool. This kind of tactic and this kind of story provides people with extrinsic motivation. And so if you use these stories on a more global scale, I kind of suggest you focus on the rewards and recognition portion and the competition, because it appeals to people's intrinsic motivators as well, which is like avoiding pain and looking like an idiot, right? But really, if you are in one of those situations where you have an adversarial relationship with the people who are fixing the vulnerabilities or who own the systems, then their first question to you is always, what's in it for me? Right? And me being the audience that you're reporting to. And so the measurements that I suggest, or that are commonly used in the last column here, are still very useful measurements. They're actually great things to keep track of, but you need to rearrange the story that you're telling with the reports that you give people to like remember the guiding principles. So apply those guiding principles to your stories too, right? Help the business control their own destiny, provide clear explanation of the controls and requirements, help the business figure out what fundamental security controls are broken, and then fix the root cause to prevent them from reoccurring, and then try to make progress. And so how you can use these measurements to tell that story is something like this. I just talked about better tactics. So the stories are, teams that have taken this training have fewer of this type of vulnerability, which means they go to market faster, and they hear from me a lot less, right? So they get to do whatever they feel like is best for them, and we get out of their way because we don't need to babysit them, right? The other things are like, your team keeps making this type of security mistake. Please make this change to your process. I will help you. And then we'll stop having this discussion, right? And then since we've implemented this tool set, we found and fixed this kind of thing that we didn't know about before. Right? So these are really good stories to tell people. The last one is the ones to tell your boss, right? And the first two are things to tell the teams who are remediating things. It's like, this is your time. I value your time, but I also need, we also need to meet certain objectives in order to do business. And none of us wants to be in the middle of a breach or anything like that. We just don't want to be bothered. Like, let's take the least friction route is actually the one that I'm proposing, is what you're trying to do again, right? So the first part, which you really do actually need to do, and lots of people just say like, no, compliance is not security. Yes, it's not security. It doesn't matter. You still need a list of the things. Like, you literally can't do business because if you fail this audit and you can't take more visa payments, or the customer won't sign because you're not ISO 27000 compliant, you have to do those things. And so that one's really easy. Have a list, assign somebody to it. The what's in it for me for other people is like, we have to do this to do business, and everybody can agree. Get down that road to build out at least the basic framework for one paved path to compliance, and then you can actually use that as either the sneaky or not sneaky road to the actual security part. The point is that when you do this and you say like, hey guys, we really, really, really need to do this, and this is the absolute minimum that I can think of that we can get away with that does this thing, you leave yourself an in to be part of the conversation. And then you actually build out frameworks, because all of them say that you have to have some kind of secure coding thing. You have to have some kind of education. You have to have some kind of tooling. That's enough for you to start a conversation that's more practical afterwards. But you have to have their agreement to do it in the first place. And that one's the easy road to building that particular portion. But you should be sure that you absolutely know what your minimum requirements are, right? And be practical about it. Again, progress is more important than being right. Okay, once you've done that, right, stick the data from your most reasonably accurate tooling, triage some of it, whatever, into one particular place. And you can tie some of that back to like the teams, the applications, the IP systems, and then do some analysis on it. At the basic, right, for application security at least, I talk to people about code quality. And this is If I don't have any other information, I at least have information about how many findings there are and how many applications I'm dealing with and what teams they belong to, right? So I can come up with an average per application. I never have enough time as a security person. And so what I do is I focus on the top 3 and the top bottom and the bottom 3. Because they're the clear outliers. They probably represent a good portion of the vulnerabilities that you're talking to. And if they don't, then that's good, because that means you've got uniform, fairly uniform code quality across the organization, and you can look into some of the other things that I'm going to talk about. But if you do have something like this, then you can focus your attention on these guys and build out reporting dashboards specifically for them, to talk to them about how they can actually make progress on their security issues and make you get out of their hair and take control over their own destiny, right? Now, the bottom 3 are also interesting in a different way, because either you don't have the tooling to find the vulnerabilities in the technology set that they have, or they're actually doing really well. If they're doing really well, then cool, take that and run with it. Like, figure out how to reward them, figure out how to give them back their autonomy, figure out, how to make a big fuss about how awesome they are, and then let them tell you how they did it, and then let them lead other people. So if you're talking about security champions, or you're talking about self-service programs, or you're talking about any of those other things, these are your targets for the teams that are noticeably doing well, are the targets for people who you should go with for those kinds of things, so you can just help them achieve things they're already achieving, but a little bit better, right? For these other ones, where they're doing very poorly, what I would suggest, here's just more information. I usually tell people, if they can get lines of code, then they can look at actual defect density, which is, lines of vulnerabilities per line of code. That sort of thing is interesting, because then you can also focus on specific applications who are causing you pain. So back to getting people to do things. If you're looking at team dashboards, something like this even helps you talk to them about actionable plans. Okay, I'm taking the top team that has the most vulnerabilities. I'm taking the total number of findings, talking about what's open and closed, just giving them a snapshot of where they are today, and then talking to them about top 3 vulnerabilities by frequency and top 3 vulnerabilities by severity. And why I want to do this? Well, it's 6 things. Actually, it's 5 things, because Java deserialization is in there twice, right? I can look at these vulnerabilities and the listing of things and actually do a back of the napkin calculation on ROI. And I can tell them, let's agree that these are problems, because they are, right? If you agree that you want to do something about them, right, and instead of me nagging you, we can address the top 3 issues by severity to close as much of your risk as possible. And then I can address the top 3 issues by frequency to get rid of as much noise as possible. Then you spend less time with me, we close lots of risk, everybody's happy, right? Now, that's a compelling story, because now I have a couple of things, 5 things, where I need to maybe educate people. I know exactly what I'm supposed to educate them on. I can calculate, is it worth taking the training? If I send people to a 1-hour training and then spend X amount of time building in security tests for this, would it be worth it? I can try to do a back of the napkin calculation on it. We can come to an agreement on timelines. We can have we have targets. They're obvious. Right? So as a team, you can then look at these things and go, how are we going to build this into your process? Going back to SMART objectives, right? Now we have the specific things. We have the measurable, we're measuring, right? We probably want one of the objectives to be reducing, right? And preventing repeats. I would say that that's generally the case, right? You know what you would probably need to attain it, which is education and tooling and maybe some better process, right? And you can talk to them about what that means and make some suggestions there, right? You guys can all agree whether or not it's realistic, and then you can get them to give you a timeline. And if you can't get them to give you a timeline, then they're not even giving a nod to security. So you probably have something to go to their boss with, right? Now, the first couple of times you do this, you're building the platform for your teams to speak to another team. You're like building this habit and a concession even for security. So bring your best negotiating face and make progress, right? Talk to them. What is reasonable? And then if you've done your homework to like do your time and effort estimation in the background, you can run the numbers to see like how long you're going to do that's going to take you to get to the end result given what they think is reasonable, right? And then you can ask their boss like, hey, you still have this, total list of things. If we concentrate on these 6 or 7 things in the next quarter, and that's the trajectory we're going to take forever, then it's going to be 10 years from now before you hit any of these things, not even counting the stuff that you don't know about today. Is that reasonable to you in terms of how long it's going to take you? Because it's your risk, and I want to be sure that you're comfortable with it. And if you say that and they're like, oh, 10 years is probably not very reasonable, then you have something to go back and negotiate further on. Right. So back to this loop, right? You've watched, you've agreed on problems, objectives, and timelines, and now you can go back and teach and fix, and you have exactly what you're going to do about that, right? So over time, you should be able to build these kinds of dashboards. Findings, trends for specific applications, open and new findings, talk to people about like, I don't care about the thing. I want the cadence of things to go down, right? I don't want you to repeat findings, and I want the number of closed findings to increase over time, right? We can track the top 3 severity issues. We're seeing the results. We're seeing that they are actually going down. We're seeing that we're closing them and they're not coming back, right? You can talk to people about training trends. As we're doing training, you can see the training influence maybe on the types of vulnerabilities you're having. As we're doing training towards the very specific things that that we've asked you to close, they are actually closing. It is actually helping. Or we're not seeing anything. So maybe we should look back and see if the training is very useful, if people are taking it, all those types of things. Right? So that is, and then, sorry, the last one is code quality. So as your program matures, hopefully you're seeing the code quality go up, and not by people avoiding like marking things as false positives in your tooling, but because genuinely they're just getting rid of the problem because they don't want to talk to you. Like, I'd love to talk to you, but not about this. Right? Now, if you're looking at campaigns that are generally more applicable across the board, because you should probably do that as part of your organization is still setting the baseline, right? As you're doing the operational stuff. So what I suggest to people is that you pull, the information across your entire whatever portfolio, and you aggregate the ground around some category. It doesn't actually matter what category it is. For application security, I will almost always choose OWASP Top 10 because it's easier, because it's an accepted part of like different compliance frameworks that they reference it as being not exactly a standard, but at least the benchmark. And so if you look at stuff like this, then you can kind of see across the organization, okay, what are the things that are causing the most noise internally? Like, let's say pick the top 1 or 2 things again, and then pick the bottom 1 or 2, but that are the most severe, and hopefully they correlate and you can track them across years. So we did this chart for a client of mine, and cross-site scripting came out as the top 2 years in a row. And so I was telling them like, hey, maybe you should run an overall campaign and work on how you're going to just close this vulnerability across the board, turn this into a common control that is going to be a thing that we're just all going to work on, because it's cluttering up all the things, right? And people can usually get behind that as well. You're showing them the numbers, right? You're showing your work. And that makes for a very good story again. And then also you can look at things like, the next top thing is Java deserialization or injection through Java deserialization. If nobody knows much about that, including on my team, then I know who I should be hiring. I know what I should be training on next. I know what education campaigns I should be looking at. I know which part of the asset management database I should be referring back to, like what project teams maybe I need to target to talk to. And I also know what I should be asking my pen testers to try to find Other things that are interestingly worth looking into are like bills of materials, so that you can, again, see what your assets actually are, so you can target the most prevalent technologies, and vulnerability control categories that you're interested in. And then just keep in mind, like, this categorization helps you look at certain things, but it doesn't cover everything. Like OWASP Top 10 doesn't cover everything. Right? So if you're looking at stuff where you're like, oh, I don't find lots of vulnerabilities in this particular category, it might just be because you're terrible at finding them. And so that's an area to look at next in terms of improvement, getting down to like, is it because we don't have any, or is it because we're not finding them? If it's not because we're not finding them, then maybe we should focus there if it's important. Okay. And then I'll just talk quickly about how we're doing and what we should be doing next. I had already talked about a lot of that in this slide deck, but here are some other things that you can do to just talk through and collect data on how you're doing and maybe get them to do their job better, right? Again, if we go back to the guiding principles, like, is the business taking control of their own destiny slowly? Are they understanding why we're trying to do the thing we're doing and making progress on it? Some of the key things for security teams is, are people using the services voluntarily, and why or why not? If they're not, then they're probably avoiding you still. And if you already know that, then cool, it's not a big deal, but you can quantify if that is getting better through both direct and indirect means. You can look at bottlenecks, pain points. You can go back to your effort estimators, do some trending there to see if you're getting better at delivery. Like, are you say, getting more things into your system faster? Things like that, right? Look at close rates. Look at whether or not people are taking the education, and then again, if that's having any effect on the types of vulnerabilities that you're finding, or the frequency of vulnerabilities, and then look back at all those other things. Who's doing well, who's not doing well. In terms of using tools and services voluntarily, there are lots of organizations where you can't get direct feedback. They're just a little bit allergic to getting feedback, or you don't have the right technology necessarily for that. One of my colleagues was working in an org where it was difficult to get direct feedback for a number of different reasons. But what he did instead was hold a couple of different communication workshops. He went and said, here's, give me a list of all the common touch points that your team and my team have. And we'll figure out, like, is it a meeting? Is it an email? Is it social media? Like, is it a web page? Is it kind of a push or pull interaction? Is it scheduled? Those types of things. And people are usually okay about at least listing things, right? And then he got people wouldn't agree to give him numbers because they didn't want to measure that. So instead, he asked them to rank the touch points in terms of what they felt was the frequency, right? At least their perceived frequency. Then he classified these touch points into things like reporting updates, education, call to action, and then did some analysis on just the perceived frequency by averages. And he found out that, hey, still, like, majority of the people thought, at least, that the call to action requests through their central mailbox about, like, doing scans was the most frequent type of communication. In fact, all their top 5 were about, like, doing scanning, right? And all of their bottom 5 were about doing education and reporting. And so none of those were about, like, reporting, and none of them were help me with this, or very, very few. And so even the team's perception tells you something about where the team's attitudes are towards each other. Who you can analyze those touch points and talk about who the most in-demand SMEs are. And then it tells you kind of a little bit about where your group is. Right? If you compare it against, like, a maturity model, you can see, like, the push versus pull interactions. You can see how adoption is sort of working with different people through things like that, and through things like maybe even scan volumes, right? So if you're just tracking, like, how many people do scans on a regular basis, that number should go up, right? So things like that. And then if you're looking back at the communications touch point, like, you can look at the data that you have from communications and then look at like, how can I reduce the do this for me scan activities? Can I build some automation? Can I build things into pipelines? Can I use the vulnerability reduction tactics like I described? Like those are more like granular objectives that you can now look at. I have from Jiang, does it closed vulnerability mean it's under control? If it isn't recurring, that it's under control, right? Lots of people just fix the one thing. So they put a Band-Aid on a bleeding wound, and you're like, okay, well, that's great. When it stops bleeding, then I'm going to say it's under control. Okay. And then some of the other things that we looked at from the communications touch point was just like the communications analysis was just to diversify channels, figure out if we have a reliance on specific people, try to use either education or like some kind of self-service mechanism to take the information out of their brain and put it out there so people can consume it differently. And then look at things like, are we relying on very specific people for very specific communication channels? So is there a churn risk? Are there specific team members who handle the majority of the interactions or the majority of specific types of tasks? Because those are the very high value people, but they have too much what we call truck value. Like if God forbid, they get hit by a truck tomorrow, this is the measure of how screwed you are, right? And it also bodes very poorly for their ability to move into different roles, which limits their career and makes them generally very unhappy. So if you can identify stuff like that, then you can also plan much better for your team's future. Okay. And then showing success. Do we have enough people to deliver? Go back and refine your time and effort estimators, return on investments and improvements over time. Look at your trending data, right? And then you can look at things like real and reported issues. So we ran this kind of report for a client of ours to try to see how accurate some of their tooling was. And it's hard to do an effort estimate, but if you're saying like, okay, I've got like 8,000 high false positives or false positives to triage on a fairly regular basis over the course of this year, for example. If I spend about a minute on each of those false positives, it takes maybe like 18 days worth of work to get rid of all that stuff in a year. So maybe I want to spend that 18 days next time to figure out if I can do better, right? If it takes me 5 minutes to triage each of these things, then it's 90 days that I wasted. So somewhere in between there is a good sweet spot to try to spend on making this particular problem more accurate. Right. And then some of the things to maybe talk about to get rid of this problem is first track down what your problems are. And then for lots of tools, you can either figure out a strategy for making the signature, for example, that finds this problem a little bit more accurate, or you can replace that specific signature with a better tool or with like QA testing or something like that. And everybody can sort of see the benefit of that because they spend less time on it, right? You all spend less time on it. And 90 days worth of recouped effort is a lot of effort. So remember these guiding principles. Empower the org, help the business control their own destiny. And now questions. Okay. Yeah, I just saw Luke's comment, which isn't exactly a question. There's a lot of references in general for which parts are you talking about. This is sort of built on my experience with different clients and thinking through this process and trying to build programs for people. I don't specifically reference frameworks except for the maturity models and some of the other things that are about frameworks that you can use for gap analysis, which I think I mentioned a couple in previous slides. So for application security, often I just tell people to check the ASVS as the first pass. And for infrastructure security, like it might be too much, but you can just go with whatever happens to be sitting in the scanning tools that you have, or like a MITRE ATT&CK framework or something like that. Okay, I'm done. Thank you all.
All right, thanks a lot, Ophi. That was a great talk. A lot of insight there. Thanks again for being part of IAC. Everyone, I put the link for the next talk inside the chat. If you got any question, Ophi can be reached. I don't know if you have a slide for your email or something.
Go back to the beginning.
Sure. And CTF registration